Most organizations believe Microsoft 365 governance is something they do. They are wrong. Governance is something that either keeps happening every day or quietly stops the moment the project ends. And Microsoft 365 isn't a product you finish configuring. It's an ecosystem that keeps creating new surfaces, teams, sites, apps, flows, agents, whether you're ready or not. Today, we're going to strip away the illusion. Why policy existing doesn't mean policy is enforced, why compliant doesn't mean controlled, and what predictable control looks like when nobody's selling you a fairy tale. The foundational misunderstanding: configuration isn't control. The foundational mistake is simple. You think governance is a set of settings. It isn't. Configuration is what you told the platform to do on a Tuesday afternoon. Control is what the platform does on a Friday night when a contractor shares a folder, a maker publishes a flow, and a new Copilot feature rolls out with defaults you didn't review. That distinction matters because Microsoft 365 is not a static system. It is a distributed decision engine. It makes thousands of authorization decisions across workloads every day with fragmented context. Entra evaluates identity signals. SharePoint evaluates link types and site permissions. Teams adds its own membership and channel permission topology. Power Platform evaluates connectors, environment boundaries, and which identity is actually executing the thing. Then Copilot shows up and queries across whatever those decisions allow. You can't configure your way out of that. Now here's where most people mess up. They confuse intent with configuration and configuration with behavior. Intent is what you think the organization means. Only owners should invite guests. Sensitive content shouldn't be broadly accessible. Flows shouldn't send data to personal email. Intent is human. It lives in policy documents, architecture diagrams, and the sentence, "We would never allow that." Configuration is the translation layer. It is brittle, it is partial, it is frequently inconsistent across workloads, and it is often implemented by copying a recommendation, applying it tenant-wide, and then discovering the business breaks, therefore exceptions appear. System behavior is the only thing that matters. The system did what it did. A guest got access, a link exists, a flow ran, a team persisted without an owner. The tenant doesn't care about your intent. And once you accept that, you start seeing why "we set the policy" becomes "we assumed the policy." Because most governance is really just visibility. A report, a dashboard, a quarterly review meeting. That is governance theater. Visibility without consequence. You can have perfect reporting and still have zero control if nothing happens when the report finds a problem. If the system detects drift and nobody is forced to fix it, you are not governing. You are collecting evidence of decay. This is the part people hate hearing, but it's true. Native Microsoft 365 governance is mostly a set of controls scattered across product boundaries. Admin centers are not a unified governance plane. They are organizational charts rendered as user interfaces. So what happens in reality? Control fails in the gap between the control plane and the work plane. The control plane is where you configure settings, admin centers, Entra policies, DLP policies, labels, retention, conditional access. The work plane is where work actually happens. People create teams, from Planner, from templates, from apps. They share files from OneDrive. They build flows from a Teams chat prompt. They invite guests because the project needs it now. Governance collapses when the work plane has more creation pathways than the control plane has enforcement points, and it always does. Once you nail that, everything else clicks. Governance outcomes are deterministic only when enforcement is deterministic. If you rely on humans remembering, governance becomes probabilistic. We usually do the review. We try to keep owners updated. We expect teams to expire. That's not governance, that's wishful thinking with an audit trail. The reason this works as a framing is that entropy accumulates through small exceptions. Every "just this once" becomes an entropy generator. Every bypass you allow, temporary guest access, a one-off sharing link, a maker allowed to use a connector, creates a pathway that will be reused, copied, and forgotten. Over time, policies drift away from intent and the tenant becomes a collection of historical accidents. And here's the trap. The platform will happily let you live in that state. It won't scream, it won't break, it will just keep producing resources faster than you can review them. So if you remember nothing else from this section, remember this. Configuration is not control. Control is enforced, continuous, and cross-service. If your governance model can't survive turnover, new workloads, new defaults, and people doing what the platform makes easy, then you don't have a governance model. You have a governance moment. Now, the uncomfortable truth: if governance has to survive entropy, it needs primitives that don't decay under scale. Ownership, lifecycle, enforcement, and proof. Not best practices, not admin checklists, primitives. And that's where we go next. Microsoft 365 governance fundamentals that survive contact with reality. Governance that survives contact with reality starts with admitting what the system is optimized for: creating things, sharing things, automating things, not retiring things, not keeping ownership current, not keeping permissions aligned with intent. So the only governance fundamentals that work are the ones that treat this ecosystem like a living authorization graph that constantly decays. There are 4 primitives that hold up under that pressure: ownership, lifecycle, enforcement, and transparency. Everything else is decoration. First, ownership and accountability. This is the root primitive because every other control depends on having someone to route decisions to. People love to treat ownership as metadata. It isn't. Ownership is an operational circuit. It is the difference between this looks risky and this gets fixed. If a team, site, group, flow, app, or agent has no accountable owner, you have an orphaned authorization surface. It will persist, it will drift, it will outlive the project that created it. And in an audit, who approved this becomes a philosophical question, not a traceable answer. So ownership governance is not make sure there are 2 owners. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Ownership governance is minimum owners, verified owners, and enforced reassignment when owners disappear. Because owners leave, contractors roll off, people change roles, the system keeps the resource. That distinction matters. Second, lifecycle management. Lifecycle is the only sprawl countermeasure that actually scales because it operates on time, not memory. Humans forget. Time doesn't. Lifecycle means you treat workspaces and automation like assets with a start date, a use phase, and an end-of-life event. And if you don't define the end, the platform will define it for you. Never. Now here's where most people mess up. They confuse inactivity with deletion. Inactivity is just silence. Silence is not the absence of risk. An inactive team with an old guest and a lingering anyone with the link file is a quiet liability, not a solved problem. Lifecycle governance means you have triggers. Expiry, renewal, archival, deletion, and escalation when nobody responds. It's not an annual cleanup day. It's a continuous pressure that forces resources to either prove relevance or die. Third, policy enforcement. This is where the fantasy collapses for most organizations because policy is easy and enforcement is expensive. Enforcement has only a handful of real verbs: block, force, expire, escalate, and remediate. Block means the action cannot happen without meeting conditions. Force means the user can proceed only through a controlled path. Expire means the system removes access unless someone reattests. Escalate means the decision is routed up a chain when the accountable person doesn't act. Remediate means the system can take corrective action automatically, not just report the issue. If your governance controls don't use those verbs, they are not controls, they are suggestions. And yes, you can do some of this natively. Conditional access blocks some access, DLP blocks some connectors, sharing settings constrains some link types. Retention can force lifecycle on content. But the native problem is consistency. Enforcement primitives vary by workload. The system enforces in one place and merely reports in another. That creates conditional chaos, a deterministic intent implemented as probabilistic behavior. Fourth, transparency. Not in the dashboard for leadership sense, in the explainable decision sense. A governed tenant must be able to answer 3 questions on demand: what exists, who owns it, and why access is allowed. Not eventually, not after a week of exporting CSVs and reconciling admin centers. On demand. That's auditability. And it's also operational sanity. Now, a common response here is, fine, we'll do reviews. This clicked for a lot of people the hard way. Manual reviews don't scale. Not because the reviewers are lazy, but because volume and drift compound. A human review process is a queue. Microsoft 365 is a fire hose. As volume grows, reviewer fatigue becomes an entropy generator. People rubber stamp. They approve because rejecting creates work. They accept risk because the system made the risky thing easy and the safe thing slow. So the governance fundamental is not do more reviews. It's design reviews that create consequences. Reviews must be time-bound, tied to ownership, and backed by enforcement. If you don't review, the system expires or escalates. Otherwise, the review is theater. And that brings us to the failure pattern behind most governance programs. They are treated like projects. They ship a policy set, declare victory, and then drift begins the next morning. So if governance has to survive reality, you anchor it on primitives that don't rely on hope: ownership, lifecycle, enforcement, and transparency. Now we can talk about why your last governance rollout didn't fail during deployment. It failed afterwards. When drift became the default state, the failure loop, projects end, drift begins. Governance programs don't usually fail during rollout. They fail after the rollout because most organizations treat governance like a migration task. Design the policies, deploy the tooling, publish the guidance, run the training, declare success. Then everyone goes back to real work and assumes the controls will hold. They won't. The system does not preserve intent. It preserves state. And state decays the moment people start using the platform in ways the platform makes convenient. So the failure loop looks the same almost everywhere. First, there's a one-time rollout mindset. We implemented sensitivity labels. We configured external sharing. We set up DLP. We blocked group creation. Yeah, in project terms, those are deliverables. In governance terms, they are starting conditions. The problem is not that those controls are useless. The problem is that they don't stay aligned with reality without a mechanism that forces them to be revalidated. A tenant is not a network appliance. It's a constant stream of new objects, new links, new connections, new identities, and new exceptions. So drift begins in 3 places: exceptions, bypasses, and new surfaces. Exceptions are the obvious one. Something breaks, the business escalates, and you add an allow clause. Then another one, then another one. Each exception is a permanent policy fork. The platform doesn't remember that the exception was supposed to be temporary. It just remembers that it's allowed. Bypasses are worse because they're often invisible. The Teams admin thinks team creation is constrained, but someone creates a Microsoft 365 group from Outlook or Planner or an app. The SharePoint admin thinks external sharing is controlled, but someone shares a file from OneDrive with a link type that wasn't considered. The Power Platform admin thinks environments are governed, but makers are still building in the default environment because it's there and it works. And then you get new surfaces. Microsoft ships new functionality constantly. New channel types, new sharing experiences, new Copilot features, new connectors, new defaults. Every new surface is a new pathway, and it arrives with default behavior that reflects a product team's incentives, not your audit requirements. Now here's the part that actually kills governance programs: reviewer fatigue. Organizations respond to drift by adding more reviews, quarterly access reviews, annual site audits, monthly owner attestations. It looks responsible, but a review process is a human queue. And your tenant is a machine that produces work faster than humans can validate it, so the review becomes a ritual. People rubber stamp. They approve because they don't want to break collaboration. They approve because they don't know what the resource is anymore. They approve because the owner left and they inherited the mess. That's not malicious. That's predictable. Rubber stamping is an entropy generator. It converts uncertainty into permanent approval. It turns "we don't know" into "we accept." And after a year or two, the organization can't distinguish between deliberate access and historical accident. Then comes the default settings myth. At tenant scale, safe defaults do not exist, not because Microsoft is negligent, because defaults have to work for millions of customers with contradictory requirements. Defaults optimize adoption. You optimize control. Those goals are not aligned. So when an admin says, "we left it at default," what they mean is, we delegated the security model to the product team and hoped the business wouldn't discover the sharp edges. They will. And finally, measurement fails. This is subtle because most organizations do have reporting. They can show counts, number of teams, number of guests, number of sharing links, number of DLP hits, number of flows. They can even show trends. But reporting that doesn't change outcomes is just a different kind of theater. If a dashboard says you have 10,000 externally shared files and nothing happens, the dashboard is not governance. It's a weekly reminder that you're operating a probabilistic security model. Governance only exists where reporting triggers consequence. Detect, root, remediate, prove. Without that loop, the failure pattern is deterministic. Projects end. Drift begins. The tenant decays. Then you launch another governance project to fix the sprawl created by the last one. That is how governance becomes a permanent series of cleanup campaigns instead of a control system. And once you see the loop, you also see what comes next. The erosion patterns are not random. They're repeatable, they compound. And they appear in every tenant because they're structural outcomes of how Microsoft 365 works at scale. So next, we map the 5 erosion patterns, the predictable ways a tenant decays, so you can stop being surprised by them. The 5 erosion patterns, a map of how tenants decay. Here's the part that should bother you. Tenants don't decay randomly. They decay in the same directions for the same reasons in almost every organization that has real adoption. Not because admins are careless, because Microsoft 365 is a system that continuously produces resources, permissions, and automation pathways faster than any human process can validate. So what follows is a map. 5 erosion patterns that show up again and again. If you can name the pattern, you can predict it. If you can predict it, you can design controls that don't rely on optimism. Pattern 1 is sprawl. Sprawl is not too many teams. Sprawl is uncontrolled creation combined with weak lifecycle. It's teams, groups, sites, channels, plans, chats, meeting artifacts, shared files, and now agents multiplying through every convenience pathway the platform offers. Even if you restrict creation in one place, creation reappears somewhere else. Sprawl is the system expressing its default behavior. Decentralize creation, centralize cleanup, and call that governance. Pattern 2 is sharing drift. Sharing drift is what happens when a workspace begins in a known state. Private team, controlled site, sensible membership, and then slowly accumulates exceptions at the file and folder level. Sharing links expire inconsistently, inheritance breaks invisibly, and just share it quickly becomes permanent exposure. The thing most people miss is that sharing drift doesn't require malicious intent. It only requires time. Every collaboration moment deposits a little access debt. Nobody pays it back. Pattern 3 is data exfiltration pathways. This is not just external sharing. This is any mechanism that moves data from a governed domain to an ungoverned domain. Email, downloads, sync clients, unmanaged devices, third-party SaaS, and, at enterprise scale, automation. The platform is full of legitimate export mechanisms, and governance fails when you can't distinguish an intentional data flow from an accidental one. The exfiltration pattern is structural because Microsoft 365 is designed to connect, integrate, and automate. The control problem isn't stop data leaving. It's stop data leaving without intent, approval, and traceable accountability. Pattern 4 is AI exposure. AI exposure is not a new risk category. It is an acceleration layer on top of the first 3 patterns. Copilot collapses the cost of discovery. What used to be hard, finding a forgotten file in a forgotten site with overly broad permissions, becomes one prompt away. That is not Copilot being dangerous. That is Copilot making your existing authorization model visible at human speed. It turns drift into output. And because it's fast, it exposes how little of your data estate is actually curated for relevance, not just protected for compliance. Pattern 5 is ownerless resources. This is the silent killer because it doesn't trigger alarms. Ownerless teams still work. Ownerless sites still serve files. Ownerless flows still run. Ownerless apps still collect data. They persist through layoffs, reorganizations, M&A, and simple boredom. And ownerless resources are the point where governance becomes mathematically impossible, because every remediation path needs a responsible human. If there is no owner, you can't attest, you can't approve, you can't expire with confidence, you can't even ask a meaningful question, because nobody has context. Now, why these 5? Because they're structural, not admin mistakes. Sprawl happens because creation is decentralized and frictionless, while retirement is centralized and slow. Sharing drift happens because collaboration happens at file level, while oversight happens at site level. Exfiltration happens because integration is the value proposition and you cannot ban your way out of your own business processes. AI exposure happens because AI is a discovery and synthesis layer that consumes whatever permissions already allow. Ownerless resources happen because identity lifecycle is managed, but resource lifecycle is not. And the compounding effect is where the real risk lives. These patterns amplify each other. Sprawl creates more places for sharing drift to accumulate. Sharing drift increases the blast radius for Copilot discovery. Automation turns sharing drift into automated exfiltration. Ownerless resources ensure none of it gets cleaned up. Now we hit the native tooling limit. Not because Microsoft doesn't provide controls, it does. Plenty. But the controls live in workload silos, with partial telemetry, inconsistent enforcement primitives, and different definitions of owner, member, guest, and external access depending on where you're standing. So governance becomes manual correlation work, exporting lists, reconciling mismatched identifiers, and arguing about what compliant means this month. Predictable control looks different. Predictable control means you can inventory everything cross-service, attach ownership everywhere, enforce lifecycle by default, and prioritize remediation by risk instead of noise. Not perfect control, predictable control. And to make this concrete, we start with the most visible rot, because it's the easiest place to stop pretending: team sprawl. Erosion case 1. Team sprawl is not a people problem. Team sprawl is the most visible form of governance failure because everyone can see it. Duplicate teams, random naming, half-dead channels, guests sprinkled across workspaces nobody remembers, a search experience that feels like archaeology. And the standard explanation is always the same. Users are creating too many teams. That's comforting. It's also wrong. Team sprawl is not a people problem, it's an architecture problem. The system makes creation cheap, reversible, and socially rewarded. It makes retirement awkward, political, and optional. So the system gets what it incentivizes. The thing most people miss is that Teams sprawl isn't even just Teams. Teams is the front door to a bundle, a Microsoft 365 group, a SharePoint site, a mailbox, a planner plan, a OneNote, meeting artifacts, apps, and now agents and copilots landing in the same space. When someone creates just a team, they're creating an asset graph. And that graph will outlive the person who clicked the button. Now here's where the decay actually starts. Creation pathways multiply. A user can create a team from Teams, but they can also create a group from Outlook. They can create a plan in Planner that lights up a group. They can create a community, an app, a template-driven workspace, or an integration that silently provisions the same primitives. So you lock down creation in one place and the tenant simply routes around it. It's not a bypass because users are clever. It's a bypass because Microsoft 365 is built from shared primitives exposed through multiple products. The platform wants you to create. It offers more doors. And when you add templates, you add gasoline. Templates are operationally useful, but they accelerate duplication because they make spin up a workspace the default response to uncertainty. Don't know where this conversation belongs? Create a team. Don't know who needs to collaborate? Create a team. Don't want to touch the existing team because it's messy? Create a team. Duplicate teams are not a failure of user training. They are the predictable output of decentralized creation with no enforced lifecycle and no authoritative directory of the one true workspace for this thing. Then you get abandoned workspaces. This is where governance theater shows up in its purest form. Organizations assume inactivity equals irrelevance. It doesn't. Inactivity means nobody posted. It does not mean nobody can access. It does not mean external access expired. It does not mean ownership is current. And it absolutely does not mean the SharePoint site behind it stopped being an exposure surface. Teams also hides the difference between not used and not risky. And the UI gets quiet, the risk doesn't. Now add guests. Guest access is not inherently bad. Most organizations need it. The problem is that guest access is almost always treated as an event, not a life cycle. A guest gets invited for a project, the project ends, the guest stays. Then the owner leaves. Then nobody remembers the approval. Time plus turnover equals permanent exposure. And Teams makes this easy because collaboration is the feature. The platform doesn't want to slow it down. So unless you force expiration and reattestation, guest access becomes a long-lived exception factory. Now, the next trap is naming policies. Admins love naming policies because they are visible. They feel like order. They produce a short-term dopamine hit. Look, everything has a prefix now. But naming is cosmetic order, not governance. A consistent name doesn't tell you whether the team has an owner. It doesn't tell you whether a guest still needs access. It doesn't tell you whether the SharePoint site behind it has broken inheritance and 5 anyone links. It tells you the name. That's it. And because naming is easy to enforce, it often becomes a substitute for the harder work: ownership enforcement, lifecycle enforcement, and external access governance. This is the uncomfortable truth. Teams sprawl continues even in mature tenants because Teams isn't governed at the Teams layer. It's governed at the Microsoft 365 primitive layer. And most organizations don't build control at that layer. They build settings in silos and hope the work plane behaves. It won't. So what does predictable control look like here? Not stop users from creating teams. That just drives shadow creation elsewhere. Predictable control means constrain creation pathways to an intentional process, require ownership at creation, attach lifecycle by default, and treat external collaboration as time-bound, reviewable access. And if you can't enforce those conditions continuously, team sprawl is not an anomaly. It is the default output. Now follow the dependency chain, because this is where the story gets worse. Team sprawl doesn't stay in Teams. It becomes SharePoint sprawl automatically. Teams governance reality, channels, guests, and conditional chaos. Teams governance gets sold as a Teams problem. It isn't. It's a permission topology problem that happens to have a chat client glued to the front. And the permission topology has evolved faster than most governance models. That's why so many tenants feel fine until they don't. Start with channels, because channels are where the clean story dies. Standard channels inherit membership from the team. That's the simple mental model most organizations still operate on. But private channels and shared channels break that model by design. They introduce sub-boundaries that don't map neatly to your original assumptions about team membership equals access. A private channel has its own membership. It is effectively a separate security island inside the team. It solves a real collaboration need, but it also creates a permission topology most orgs never model, never inventory correctly, and almost never lifecycle manage. A shared channel goes further. It creates cross-team collaboration with a link-like behavior. People from outside the team can participate without becoming full members of the team. That sounds controlled, but it's also a new pathway for access drift because you've created a collaboration surface that sits outside the original team membership boundary. That distinction matters. Because when you ask, who has access to this workspace, the correct answer becomes it depends what you mean by workspace. The team, the site, the channel, the files associated with the channel, the meeting artifacts. If your governance model can't answer that cleanly, you don't have a model. You have a set of assumptions. Now layer guests on top of that topology. Most organizations need guests. The governance failure is not guests exist. The failure is treating guest access as a static setting rather than a lifecycle-bound risk decision. Guests enter through a moment of urgency. A vendor needs access, a partner needs a file, a consultant needs to collaborate. The invite happens, the work gets done, then the org forgets to unwind it. Teams doesn't naturally force that unwinding. It gives you knobs, allow or block guests, restrict domains, limit capabilities. Fine. But the system still does the one thing you didn't design for. It preserves access until someone removes it. So guest access becomes permanent exposure by default. And because Teams has multiple entry points for external collaboration, you end up with what looks like controlled external access in a policy document, but external reach in the real tenant. That reach includes guests, link-based sharing behind the team's SharePoint site, and content forwarded into other systems. Then comes ownership drift. This is the part that should make you tired because it's so predictable. Owners leave, they change roles, they get disabled, they go on parental leave, they move to a new division. The team remains, the channels remain, the guest remains, the files remain. If there's no enforced ownership reassignment, You now have a resource with authority but no accountable human, and any governance process that depends on the owner to review access has already failed. Quietly, that's how Teams becomes beyond control. Not because it can't be controlled, but because you didn't enforce the one primitive that makes control rootable, ownership. And then there's lifecycle. Teams gives you archiving. People love archiving because it feels like closure. Archive is not end of life. Archive is a state change in a collaboration UI. It does not automatically solve ownership. It does not necessarily solve external access. It does not necessarily solve share links. It does not necessarily solve the fact that the SharePoint site is still there, still searchable based on permissions, still part of the tenant's content universe. So archiving becomes another governance illusion. The workspace feels done. Therefore, people stop thinking about it. The system keeps serving it. Now, about conditional access. Everyone wants conditional access to be the answer to everything because it's one of the few places where enforcement feels real. Conditional access is access gating. It is not continuous governance. It evaluates a session. It does not manage lifecycle. It does not clean up permission drift. It does not fix ownerless resources. It does not stop someone with legitimate access from sharing content into a broader boundary. And when organizations try to use conditional access to compensate for governance gaps, they end up creating conditional chaos, a complex web of exceptions that turns deterministic intent into probabilistic behavior. Most people try to tighten policies, but business breaks. Therefore, exceptions get added. Therefore, the policy becomes a negotiated document, not an enforced boundary. So what do you actually control in Teams if you want predictable outcomes? You control creation pathways, not by banning creation, but by forcing creation through a path that attaches ownership, classification, and lifecycle upfront. You control ownership, minimum owners, verified owners, and automated reassignment when owners disappear. You control external access, time-bound guests, review cadences, and expiration that is enforced, not merely requested. And you control expiration. Teams and groups should not exist forever by accident. If nobody can justify the workspace on a schedule, it should degrade, escalate, and eventually die. Once you accept this, Teams governance stops being a Teams admin topic. It becomes data governance and lifecycle governance with a chat front end. And now the dependency chain snaps into focus. Every Teams failure becomes a SharePoint failure because the data lives there. So let's follow the data. SharePoint is where drift becomes permanent. Erosion case 2. SharePoint sharing drift is inevitable. SharePoint is where governance programs go to die quietly, because SharePoint is where workspace governance becomes file reality. And file reality is messy, emotional, and optimized for speed. A SharePoint site almost always starts its life in a known state. Someone provisions it from a template, it inherits the group membership, maybe it gets a label, maybe it has a retention policy, maybe external sharing is controlled. Everyone feels good. The site is compliant. Then work begins, and drift begins with it. The drift mechanism isn't complicated. It's human collaboration meeting a permission model that allows exceptions at every layer. A document gets shared because someone needs it now. A folder gets shared because the vendor can't find the file. A link gets created because it's faster than adding a guest and explaining Teams. And none of those actions feel like governance decisions in the moment. They feel like work. Over time, those small decisions accumulate into a sharing model that no longer resembles the original intent. The site is still labeled, the site still has policies, the site still looks compliant in a dashboard, but access has drifted. Now here's where most people mess up. They treat SharePoint permissions as a site-level control problem. They focus on membership and assume that's where access lives. It doesn't. Access lives in links, broken inheritance, and ad hoc grants. Broken inheritance is the long-lived exception factory. It exists because SharePoint allows you to break permissioned inheritance at the library, folder, and file level forever. Once you do it, you've created a branch in the authorization graph that will not heal itself. It will persist until someone deliberately unwinds it, which almost nobody does because unwinding it requires context. And context is what SharePoint doesn't preserve. So you get a long tail of unique permissions that nobody can confidently delete. Every year that tail grows. Every reorg makes it worse. Every just share it creates another artifact. And then you get link types. Anyone links and company-wide links look like convenience features. Architecturally, they are blast radius modifiers. They change the access boundary from a known set of people to anyone who can obtain the URL or anyone in the tenant, regardless of whether they were ever meant to see the content. The platform encourages these links because they reduce friction. Governance fails because friction was the only thing preventing oversharing. The quiet danger is that link-based access doesn't look like a permission grant to most users. It looks like sending a URL. It feels temporary, it feels reversible. In practice, it's durable, copyable, forwardable, and rarely reviewed. And you can add expiration, sure, but if you don't enforce expiration, you've just moved from permanent oversharing to oversharing until someone remembers to turn on the right settings everywhere. That's not a control model. That's hope with a calendar. Now, sensitivity labels. This is where governance theater becomes sophisticated because labels make people feel like they solved the problem. The file says confidential, and the site says highly confidential. The compliance team sees coverage, and none of that answers the only question that matters. who can reach the content today. Labels are classification and, depending on configuration, protection. But they are not automatically access governance. A file can be labeled confidential and still be shared broadly inside the tenant, or have an old link floating around, or sit in a site where everyone is a member, because that's how we work. This is why label coverage can rise while risk rises. You've improved metadata, you haven't improved access boundaries. Then there's the accumulated technical debt, customizations, legacy patterns, and half migrations. SharePoint has been around long enough that every org has a fossil record. Old sites with weird permission structures, libraries with bespoke workflows, external sharing rules that changed over time, sites created under previous admin regimes with different defaults. This is not misconfiguration, this is architectural erosion. And it matters because Copilot, search, and automation don't care which decade your site came from. They treat it as content with permissions. If access exists, it can be discovered. If it can be discovered, it can be used. So what's the governance reality in SharePoint? Sharing drift is inevitable because the platform permits drift at the point of work. Every exception pathway is a feature. Your job is not to stop humans from collaborating. Your job is to stop collaboration decisions from becoming permanent exposure. That requires three things: constrained link types, time-bound sharing by default, and forced periodic attestation from accountable owners. And that last part is the real one, because SharePoint will let your content survive forever, but it will also let your mistakes survive forever. And once you accept that, you stop asking, how do we make SharePoint compliant? You start asking, how do we keep SharePoint from quietly becoming public, one link at a time? SharePoint governance reality. Why label it doesn't fix it. This is the foundational misunderstanding in SharePoint governance. People think classification is governance. It isn't. A sensitivity label tells you what the content is supposed to be. It does not reliably tell you who can reach it today. And the moment you confuse those two, you build a compliance program that looks impressive in screenshots and collapses in discovery. Sensitivity labels at their best are transport protection. They can apply encryption, restrict sharing behavior, and persist protection when a file leaves SharePoint. That matters. It's one of the few mechanisms that can outlive the container. But labels are not a continuous access governance system. They don't repair broken inheritance. They don't recall old links. They don't remove shadow users. They don't expire broad internal access. They don't magically create an accountable owner who will make the ugly decision to remove someone's access. So the real question isn't, is it labeled? The real question is, who can open it right now with the credentials they already have? And SharePoint answers that question through the permission graph, not the label catalog. Now here's where most people get trapped. They implement labels, they publish guidance, they measure coverage, and they declare progress. Meanwhile, the sharing model continues to drift underneath them because users don't think in labels. They think in outcomes. Can this person get the file? So they use the fastest path: links, folder shares, direct grants, forwarded URLs. Sometimes the user doesn't even know they're creating a long-lived access object. They just clicked copy link. And because SharePoint makes it easy to create those access objects, you get a system where the metadata becomes more mature while the access boundary becomes more porous. That's why label it doesn't fix it, because the label is not the enforcement plane. It's a tag with optional protection, and optional is not control. The next part that separates beginners from pros is understanding external sharing controls versus external reach. External sharing controls are tenant-level and site-level settings. Which link types are allowed, whether guests are allowed, whether anonymous links are allowed, whether domains are restricted. External reach is what actually exists in your tenant today. Active guest accounts, shared links that already escaped, files shared from OneDrive into personal mailboxes, content copied into other systems, and company-wide links that effectively create internal exfiltration into the entire organization. You can clamp down settings today and still be exposed tomorrow because the exposure was created yesterday. And if you can't inventory yesterday, you can't control today. This is why the long tail is so dangerous. Orphaned sites and stale permissions. Every tenant accumulates them. Every reorg adds them. Every M&A event multiplies them. Every "we'll clean up later" turns into "we don't know what this is, so we won't touch it." SharePoint is a perfect museum of organizational entropy. And Copilot is about to give everyone a guided tour. So governance reality in SharePoint looks like this. The only reliable control objectives are the ones that change what the system can do, not what the spreadsheet says. You control link types. You decide what default sharing means and you force it. You do not allow anyone links unless you accept what that phrase literally means. You control expiration, not "we recommend expiry." Default expiry, enforced expiry, with a business process that renews access intentionally instead of letting it persist by accident. You control owner attestations. Owners must periodically certify, yes, this site still matters. Yes, these broad links still make sense. Yes, these external users still belong. And if they don't respond, you escalate. If escalation fails, you degrade access. If degradation fails, you expire. You control lifecycle triggers. Site created for a project, then the end of the project must trigger review and archival or deletion. Archive should be a governance action with consequences, not a UI state that makes people feel better. And you control remediation of stale permissions. Deleted users, disabled users, and shadow grants should not sit in place for years waiting for a human to notice. That is not governance. That is archaeological risk management. Now, the reason this works is that it turns governance into a continuous circuit. Detect, root, remediate, prove, not label and hope. And once you get honest about SharePoint, you start seeing the next failure pattern. The sharing model doesn't stay inside SharePoint. It leaks into OneDrive by design, and then automation shows up and industrializes it, because the most dangerous permission in Microsoft 365 isn't owner. It's can automate access to data nobody remembers exists. Erosion case 3. Power Automate as a data exfiltration fabric. Power Automate is where governance stops pretending. Because once you allow automation, you've moved past who can access data and into what can move data, where, and under which identity. And most tenants have no idea. This erosion pattern usually starts innocently. A user builds a helper flow to save time, send an email when a form is submitted, copy an attachment to a folder, notify a channel when something changes. It's helpful, it works, and it feels harmless. Then it becomes relied on. Then it becomes business process, without ever becoming governed. That's the first failure mode. Flows become production systems without review because the platform makes publishing frictionless. There's no architectural moment where the system forces you to say, this is now operational software. It just runs, and because it runs, people trust it. Now here's where most people mess up. They treat Power Automate as low code and assume low code means low risk. Risk isn't about how the thing is built. Risk is about what it can reach, and flows can reach almost everything. Connector sprawl is the next predictable outcome. Organizations talk about sanctioned connectors like it's a solved boundary. Microsoft connectors are safe, third-party connectors are risky, block the risky ones. That's a comforting story. It's also incomplete. The real risk comes from sanctioned connectors used in unsanctioned ways. Outlook is sanctioned. So is SharePoint. So is OneDrive. So is Teams. So is HTTP, depending on what you allow. So is any connector that can take content out of a controlled boundary and push it somewhere else. A flow that reads from SharePoint and emails a file to a personal mailbox is exfiltration. A flow that reads from a labeled library and drops content into an unmanaged location is exfiltration. A flow that iterates a list and posts the results into a chat is exfiltration if the audience boundary is wrong. The system doesn't know intent. It only knows that the connectors allow it. High-risk paths are not exotic. They're boring. Email.http calls or file exports, third-party SaaS destinations, anything that turns data at rest in M365 into data in motion outside the tenant's governed boundary. And the thing that makes this dangerous at scale is that flows don't need to be malicious to cause harm. They just need to be convenient. A maker solves a local problem and accidentally creates a global leak. Now, the most misunderstood part, credential ambiguity. People assume flows run as the user. They often don't. Sometimes they run under the author's connection. Sometimes they run under a shared service account. Sometimes they run under a connector that has broader privileges than the person who triggered the flow. Sometimes they run as a run-only user, but execute actions using the creator's connection. So you end up with an authorization model that is not deterministic from the user's perspective. A person clicks a button, but the flow executes with someone else's privileges. That distinction matters because now you've created a shadow privilege escalation pathway that doesn't look like privilege escalation. It looks like automation, and you can tell yourself you'll audit it. But audits miss it because flows hide in volume and fragmented ownership. Power Automate estates grow fast. People create flows in the default environment. They create them in teams. They create them as part of templates. They copy them. They fork them. They abandon them. And the platform does not force ownership hygiene. So you end up with the same silent killer from earlier, just in automation form, ownerless flows. When the maker leaves, the flow doesn't necessarily stop. It just becomes unaccountable. It continues to run, continuing to move data, with nobody responsible for the behavior. That's not hypothetical, that's how the platform behaves. And the native visibility is structurally fragmented. Admins can see some things in the Power Platform Admin Center, some things in Purview, some things in audit logs, and some things only when someone opens the flow and notices. That's not a unified risk model. That's a scavenger hunt. So Power Automate becomes a data exfiltration fabric, not because it's evil, but because it's an automation layer attached to a permission model that was never designed to be continuously verified at scale. If you're relying on approved makers and periodic reviews, you've already accepted a probabilistic outcome. You'll catch some, you'll miss some. And the ones you miss will be the ones that quietly root data out of the boundary you thought you had. Now, the system does have a control primitive here, DLP. But DLP without context is its own trap. And that's next. Power Automate governance reality. DLP without context is a trap. DLP is the control Microsoft gives you when Power Automate starts scaring people. And yes, you need it, but here's the problem. Most organizations treat DLP like a risk model. It isn't. DLP is a boundary tool. It categorizes connectors and decides which combinations can coexist. It can block obvious bad patterns. It can stop the laziest form of exfiltration. It can prevent copy from SharePoint to Dropbox if you've decided Dropbox is outside the fence. That's useful. But it's not governance because it has no context of intent, scale, or consequence. Here's what DLP actually knows. Connector A talked to connector B in environment X under policy Y. It does not know whether the data was sensitive. It does not know whether the destination was appropriate for the business process. It does not know whether the flow runs once a year or 10,000 times a day. It does not know whether the flow is owned by someone accountable or abandoned by someone who left. So if you use DLP as your primary governance layer, you will do the thing every organization does. You will overblock. You block broadly because you're trying to reduce risk quickly. The business breaks because the platform was actually being used for real work. And then you create exceptions to unblock the work. Those exceptions don't stay small, they multiply. Every exception is justified in isolation. This team needs this connector. This department can't function without that integration. We'll review it later. And then later never arrives because you didn't design the review loop. This is the failure. Broad blocks create friction. Friction creates escalation. Escalation creates exceptions. And exceptions convert your deterministic boundary into a probabilistic one. That is not misconfiguration. That is architectural erosion. And DLP accelerates it when you treat it like a yes-no switch rather than a risk-scored system. Now here's the more subtle trap, low signal findings. A DLP violation looks urgent because it's a violation. But the platform can produce thousands of equally urgent events with no hierarchy. Once everything looks like a fire, nobody fights fires. They triage by annoyance. So the team focuses on what breaks loudly, not what leaks quietly. And that means the highest risk flows often survive because they're operationally stable. They run, they don't error, they don't call the help desk, they just move data. So DLP becomes a theater prop. You can say you have DLP. You can show policies. You can show categories. You can show blocked connectors. And you can still have high-risk exfiltration because the dangerous parts are inside the allowed boundary. Think about this. Outlook is allowed in almost every tenant. SharePoint is allowed. OneDrive is allowed. Teams is allowed. If those connectors can be combined, you can build a flow that moves sensitive data into email, into chat, into personal storage, into places where retention and access behave differently than you intended. DLP didn't fail. Your risk model failed because you never built one. So what actually matters when you want to govern Power Automate? 3 inputs: data source sensitivity, destination, and scale. Data source sensitivity is not, does the flow use SharePoint? It's which site, which library, what classification, and what permissions exist around that data. If you can't map the flow's inputs to actual content risk, you're blind. Destination is not, is the connector approved? It's, does the destination expand the audience boundary? Email expands boundaries. HTTP expands boundaries. Export to file expands boundaries. Even posting into a large Teams channel expands boundaries if the channel membership is messy. Scale is the multiplier. A risky flow that runs once is a bad idea. A risky flow that runs continuously is a leak engine. And most tenants have no ability to distinguish those two quickly because they don't inventory flows with operational metadata and ownership. So the control objectives are not block these connectors. The control objectives are inventory, ownership, tiered environments, and least privilege execution. Inventory means you know what flows exist, where they live, what connectors they use, and what they touch. Not a one-time export, a continuously updated view. Ownership means every flow has someone accountable, and the moment that person disappears, the flow is forced into review, reassignment, or retirement. Ownerless automation is unacceptable because automation without accountability is just a machine doing things nobody will explain to an auditor. Tiered environments means you stop pretending the default environment is a safe place to build. The default environment is a governance sinkhole because it's where everything goes when you didn't design a home. Real governance means development environments, controlled promotion paths, and boundaries that reflect risk. And least privilege execution means you stop allowing flows to run under ambiguous identities. You design for explicit run contexts with credentials that are reviewable and expirable, not shared and forgotten. Now, the system law, DLP, is necessary, but it is not sufficient. If you rely on it alone, you will either cripple the business or drown in exceptions. If you combine it with ownership, inventory, and risk prioritization, it becomes one layer in a real control plane. And once you accept that, you're ready for the next multiplier, Copilot. Because Copilot doesn't just reveal your permission mistakes, it speeds up every mistake you've already automated. Erosion case 4. Copilot doesn't create risk, it reveals it. Copilot doesn't create new risk categories. It doesn't magically invent new permissions. It doesn't open doors that were locked. It just turns the lights on. And the reason that feels like a security incident is because most tenants have been operating in the dark for years, relying on friction and obscurity as a control mechanism. That mechanism is now dead. Copilot is a discovery interface for your existing authorization graph. Whatever a user can reach through normal access rules, Copilot can summarize, correlate, and surface at conversational speed. The platform did not change your permissions. The platform changed the cost of finding what those permissions already allow. So the first Copilot risk isn't AI, it's surprise. An employee asks a normal question, and Copilot produces an answer that includes a document from a site they didn't even know existed. They technically had access. They just never had a reason to go looking. That file sat in the corner of the tenant like a forgotten chemical drum in the back of a warehouse. Copilot didn't spill it. Copilot put a label on it and handed it to someone. This is why the phrase Copilot readiness is mostly a lie. Not because readiness is impossible, but because most organizations interpret readiness as a cleanup sprint. We'll roll it out, then we'll fix permissions. That's backwards. Because Copilot collapses time to exposure, what you used to discover after months of drift and a lucky audit gets discovered in a day by normal users in normal workflows with no malicious intent. AI turns hard to find into one prompt away. That distinction matters. Before Copilot, a messy tenant could still function because discovery had a cost. Users needed to know where to look. They needed to stumble into the right team. They needed to remember the site name. They needed to ask someone. And those steps acted as informal friction. Copilot removes the friction. Now the second trap, wrongness. Copilot isn't only a security story, it's also a trust story. The wrong answer is not usually caused by hallucination. Most of the time, the wrong answer is caused by correct retrieval from obsolete data. Duplicate versions, drafts that were never deleted, old policy documents that still exist, sites that should have been archived, teams created for a project that ended 3 years ago but still have permissive access. So the risk becomes organizational decision-making based on stale truth. And your controls won't catch that because compliance tools are not relevance tools. Retention is not curation. Labels are not truth. Copilot will confidently summarize whatever it can access. If the data estate is messy, the output will be messy. That's not Copilot misbehaving. That's Copilot reflecting your tenant. This clicked for a lot of people the first time they saw Copilot quote a document that everyone forgot about. They didn't suddenly become insecure. They were always insecure. They just stopped being able to hide behind chaos. Now add the compounding effect. Every new workspace is now a new knowledge surface. Every team created without lifecycle becomes a permanent search target. Every SharePoint site with broken inheritance becomes a future Copilot source. Every OneDrive link that never expired becomes a retrieval pathway. Every flow that copies data into the wrong place becomes an amplifier because it increases the volume of discoverable content in that location. Copilot doesn't just reveal drift, it rewards drift by making it useful. That's why the readiness myth is so dangerous. We'll clean up after rollout is really, we'll let AI scale our mistakes and then try to unscale them. That doesn't work. Because once users start relying on Copilot outputs, the mess becomes operationally embedded. People build workflows around the answers they get. Teams create habits. And now you're not just cleaning permissions, you're cleaning cultural dependency on a system that's consuming an uncurated data estate. And then you get the quietest failure, governance by embarrassment. Organizations start treating Copilot incidents as user mistakes. Don't ask that. Be careful what you prompt. Use better phrasing. That's the same governance theater, just with new vocabulary. Prompt discipline is not a control plane. The control plane is still ownership, lifecycle, and enforced access boundaries. Copilot just makes the absence of those primitives obvious. So the real Copilot governance question is not how do we configure Copilot, it's what is Copilot allowed to see, and do we actually mean that? If you can't answer that, you shouldn't roll it out broadly, not because Copilot is unsafe, but because your tenant is unsupervised. And the final point, because it sets up what comes next. Copilot doesn't just surface content, it accelerates creation. It makes it easier to generate documents, build flows, build agents, and spin up new workspaces. So it speeds up the very entropy that broke governance in the first place. And that means the next collapse point is inevitable. If you don't have an ownership model that survives turnover, Copilot readiness doesn't exist. It's just your tenant moving faster. Copilot and agent governance. Who controls what it sees and who builds? Once Copilot is in the tenant, the next governance illusion shows up fast. People assume Copilot governance is a single toggle. It isn't. Copilot is not one thing. It's a delivery mechanism for many things: chat experiences, grounded retrieval, plugins, connectors, and now agents. And agents are where governance stops being a content problem and becomes an identity problem. Because an agent is not a document. An agent is a decision-making surface with tools. And the thing most people miss is that agent sprawl is going to look exactly like team sprawl, except it will be harder to see and faster to multiply. If team sprawl creates abandoned containers, agent sprawl creates abandoned actors. So the control questions you need to answer are not philosophical, they're mechanical. Who controls data scope? Who controls tool scope? Who controls builder scope? And who controls publishing scope? Start with data scope. What can the agent see? In Microsoft 365 terms, an agent is grounded in whatever its configuration points to, plus whatever the invoking user already has access to, plus whatever the underlying tool calls can retrieve. That means you don't have an agent, and you have a compound permission story The agent can be configured with SharePoint content, sites, or other knowledge sources. It can connect to systems, and the agent output will reflect that reach. So you need to treat knowledge sources like access grants, not like content attachments. And if you can't inventory which agents are connected to which repositories, you've already lost. Because what does the agent know becomes whatever it could reach when someone configured it 3 months ago. Now, tool scope. What can the agent do? This is where most organizations will get burned because they'll fixate on retrieval and ignore action. But the agent that can only read is a search assistant. The agent that can act is an automation front end. So the real boundary is not can it answer questions, it's can it trigger workflows, call APIs, send email, move files, create tickets, and change state. And once you allow action, you need to decide whether the agent acts as the user, as the maker, or as a service identity. That's not a minor implementation detail. That's the security model. If the agent executes with the author's credentials, you've created a privilege proxy. Users can trigger actions that run under someone else's authority. If it executes as the invoking user, you get a more deterministic model, but you also inherit the user's permission chaos. If it executes as a service identity, you gain control, but only if you govern that identity like a privileged workload. These pathways accumulate. Now, builder scope. Who can build agents? This is where the tenant decays quietly because most organizations won't stop it. They can't. The business wants innovation. Microsoft makes it easy. And blocking creators just drives people to third-party AI, which is worse. So the governance goal is not prevent building. It's make building governable. That means builders are identities with entitlements. You don't give everyone the ability to publish agents with access to sensitive repositories and powerful connectors. You scope who can build, where they can build, which tools they can use, and what promotion path exists from experimentation to production. If you don't do this, you get shadow AI, agents built in the wrong place with the wrong sources, using credentials nobody reviewed and shared informally because it's useful. Then publishing scope. Who can deploy agents and to whom? This is the enterprise trap. A useful agent spreads socially. Someone shares it with a team, then another team. Then it becomes the way we do it. And suddenly the agent's audience boundary is far larger than the risk boundary you assumed at creation. So publishing has to be treated like app deployment, not like link sharing. There has to be inventory. There has to be ownership. There has to be lifecycle. There has to be review cadence. Treat agents like identities. Give them owners. Give them environments. Give them expiration. Give them an attestation rhythm. And when an agent has no owner, you don't keep it just in case. You quarantine it, you reassign it, or you kill it. Now the shortcut, nobody teaches. You can't govern agents after they proliferate. You can only govern their creation pathways. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Agents are a control plane expansion. They widen the set of things that can be asked, found, and done. If you let them sprawl the way you let teams sprawl, you won't just have messy collaboration. You'll have unaccountable execution. And that's the moment where Copilot governance stops being a feature discussion. It becomes the question that ends careers in audit meetings. Who approved this thing to act in your tenant? And where is that approval enforced today? Well, identity governance, Entra as control plane, not governance solution. So the organization finally gets serious and says, fine, we'll do identity governance. Good, that's the correct instinct. And then the next illusion shows up, the belief that Entra is the governance solution for the tenant. It isn't. Entra is the control plane for identity decisions. It is not the control plane for tenant lifecycle hygiene. That distinction matters because most of the mess you're trying to fix isn't who can sign in. It's what persists when nobody is responsible. Entra's job is to answer one question over and over. Should this identity be allowed to authenticate and receive tokens for this resource under these conditions? That's access gating. Tenant governance is something else. Continuous cross-workload enforcement of ownership, lifecycle and risk boundaries across Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, Power Platform, and now agents. So yes, identity governance is critical, but it will not rescue you from sprawl. It will not clean up your dead workspaces. It will not unwind broken inheritance. And it will not stop automation from using legitimate tokens to move data out of your boundaries. Now, conditional access is where people usually anchor their hope, because it's one of the few places where the platform actually says no. But conditional access is not a governance loop. It is a gate at the edge. It's a policy evaluation at sign-in and token issuance time. It does not recheck whether the user still needs access next week. It does not inspect whether the group they're in is stale. It does not remove the guest you forgot about. It does not expire a team. It does not reassign an owner. It does not review whether your app registration still needs mail. Read-write.conditional access can reduce exposure. It cannot maintain intent. And then there's app registrations and service principals, which is where identity governance becomes a mirror of the same decay patterns you've already seen elsewhere. An app registration starts as a project artifact. It exists for a reason. Automation, integration, reporting, CI/CD, just make graph calls. Fine. Then it accumulates permissions. Then the project ends. then the service principal stays. And nobody remembers why it has what it has. This is the identity version of ownerless resources. It's the same story, just wearing a different badge. The tenant fills with service principals that have broad delegated permissions or application permissions or certificates that never expire because we'll rotate them later. As later, like everything else, becomes never. And once those artifacts exist, they become entropic by design. They do not self-audit. They do not self-reduce privilege. They do not self-delete when the employee who created them leaves. The system preserves state. So identity governance has a clear objective that most organizations don't actually implement: make identity artifacts reviewable and expirable. Not reviewed once. Reviewable continuously. That means app registrations need owners you can route escalation to. Service principals need lifecycle. Privileged roles need time-bound activation. Access packages need policies that end. Guest identities need expiration and revalidation. Workload identities need the same governance posture as human identities because they are the ones doing the quiet work. And yes, Entra gives you tools: access reviews, entitlement management, PIM, lifecycle workflows. Those are real control primitives, but here's the catch. They are identity primitives. They do not automatically map to the messy resource world unless you design that mapping. A SharePoint site can exist with no meaningful owner, even if the user lifecycle is perfect. A team can exist long after all the members moved on, even if offboarding is flawless. A flow can keep running under a shared connection even if the maker is gone. So if you treat Entra governance as the governance solution, you'll build a deterministic identity model attached to a probabilistic resource estate. And you will still fail audits because auditors don't ask, "Did you have MFA?" They ask, "Who approved access to this resource and why do they still have it?" Identity governance can help answer the who, but it often can't answer the resource because the resource governance layer is fragmented. So Entra should be treated as what it is, the identity decision engine, and then you build above it a unified governance layer that can take identity signals, owner, manager, department, termination, role changes, and translate them into enforcement across the work plane. That's the pattern. Identity provides authoritative signals, but governance needs to consume those signals and drive consequences in Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, Power Platform, and agents. Otherwise, you've built a perfect gate in front of a building where nobody knows what rooms exist anymore. And now we get to the biggest entropy generator at scale, the Power Platform. Because once citizen development hits enterprise volume, governance stops being a security controls discussion. It becomes an architecture survival problem. Erosion case 5, ownerless resources, the silent killer. Ownerless resources are the point where every other governance idea collapses, not because the controls don't exist, because the control loop has no endpoint. Every policy, every review, every lifecycle process, every please validate this access mechanism assumes there is a human who can answer for the resource, someone who understands why it exists, who it serves, and what breaks if you touch it. When that person doesn't exist, governance becomes guesswork with admin privileges. And guesswork is not a control model. Ownerless teams are the obvious ones. The original owners leave, the team keeps running, and now nobody has the authority or the context to clean it up. Membership stays stale, guests stay invited, channels stay messy. The associated SharePoint site continues to store content. People still have access even if they never use it. The resource is alive. Accountability is dead. Ownerless sites are worse because the site is the data plane. It's where files live, where inheritance breaks, where links accumulate, where retention policies pretend to be a life cycle strategy. When nobody owns the site, nobody certifies whether the sharing model is still valid. Nobody knows whether that folder shared to someone external was still needed. Nobody knows if the company-wide links were intentional or just laziness. So those permissions persist, not because anyone chose them, because nobody removed them. Ownerless flows are the most dangerous version of this pattern because they don't just expose data, they move it. A flow can run for months after the maker leaves. It can keep using existing connections. It can keep exporting data. It can keep emailing attachments. And when it fails like any other automation, quietly or noisily, but without telling you why it existed in the first place. It's operational software without an owner. That is pure entropy. Ownerless apps are the same story with a UI. They often sit in the default environment. They collect data, they write to Dataverse or SharePoint lists, they embed flows, they get shared in Teams chats, then the builder moves on. The app stays, the data stays, and suddenly the audit question isn't, is this secure? It's who approved this system? And you don't have an answer. Now people will try to solve this with reporting. They'll generate a list, they'll open a ticket, they'll assign it to an admin, they'll ask IT to become the owner just to fix it. That is the moment governance turns into security debt. Because making IT the owner is not ownership, it's custodianship without context. It can hold the keys, but IT doesn't know what doors should exist. So the remediation becomes one of 3 bad outcomes. Ignore it, delete it, and break something, or keep it and pretend it's controlled. This is why ownerless resources are the silent killer. They don't throw obvious errors. They don't always create visible incidents. They just accumulate risk until a discovery event happens. An audit, a breach, a Copilot prompt, a merger, a lawsuit, a data subject request, a privileged access review that asks a simple question nobody can answer. Why is this still here? Now, why do ownerless resources happen? Not because people are lazy. Because the tenant is designed to let resources outlive humans. Turnover is normal, projects end, reorgs happen, M&A happens, contractors leave, accounts get disabled, distribution lists change, people move teams. And in all of that churn, the platform will happily preserve the artifacts that were created at peak enthusiasm. It will not preserve the intent. And that distinction is fatal. Intent is not stored in Teams metadata. Intent is not stored in SharePoint permissions. Intent is not stored in flows. The only thing that approximates intent is ownership, because ownership is the routable link to context. Remove that link and the system becomes ungovernable by definition. So here's the core claim, stated plainly. Without ownership, governance is impossible, not hard impossible, because governance is not visibility. Governance is decision-making with consequence, and decision-making requires accountability. This is why the control plane pattern later in this video starts with ownership enforcement, not policy tuning. You can't DLP your way out of a tenant full of orphan systems. You can't label your way out. You can't conditional access your way out. Those are controls that assume a stable resource lifecycle. Ownerless resources are the absence of lifecycle. So the correct first move is not another policy. It's to make ownership a primitive you enforce everywhere. Minimum owners, no owner remediation, escalation paths, and expiration when accountability cannot be restored. Because if you don't do that, every other governance investment becomes theater again, and the tenant stays beyond control. Power Platform Governance Reality. Citizen development at enterprise scale. Power Platform governance is where good intentions go to be operationalized into chaos. Not because citizen developers are reckless, because the platform is structurally designed to let small solutions become enterprise dependencies without ever passing through an enterprise control point. This is the core mismatch. IT thinks in systems, makers think in outcomes. The platform rewards outcomes, so the estate grows in the only direction it can, outward. Start with environments, because environments are the only boundary primitive the Power Platform gives you that resembles a tenancy within the tenancy. And most organizations ignore them until it hurts. The default environment is the governance sinkhole. It exists. It's always there. It's easy. Everyone can build in it unless you explicitly stop them. So everything ends up there. Prototypes, personal automations, departmental apps, temporary solutions that quietly become permanent, and experiments that accidentally touch real data. That distinction matters, because once business logic lives in the default environment, you have no meaningful separation between experimentation and production. You have one shared pool of makers, connectors, data sources, and privileges. You've turned your tenant into a shared development workstation. And then you act surprised when something breaks. Next comes connector sprawl, and it's worse than people admit. The uncomfortable truth. Sanctioned connector is not the same as safe behavior. SharePoint, Outlook, Teams, Dataverse, and HTTP are not benign just because they're Microsoft or common. They are data movement interfaces, so the risk is not third-party connectors exist. The risk is that connectors allow lateral movement between systems with different governance models. A Power App with a nice UI can call a flow that uses a connector with broad access. Users interact with the app and believe they're operating inside a controlled business process. In reality, the app is a front end to automation with whatever privileges the builder attached. Power Apps and flows become coupled risk. The UI hides the behavior. That means your threat model can't stop at who has access to the app. You have to model what does the app execute under which identity and what does it touch, and most tenants don't. Then there's the default maker culture failure. People promote solutions by copying them. Copying an app copies its assumptions. Copying a flow copies its connectors. Copying a solution copies its security model. Each copy is a new artifact with a life cycle that nobody designed. It's sprawl with the appearance of agility. Now add the bigger spillover, Power BI and Fabric. Most organizations treat reporting as read-only, therefore low risk. That's a childish model of information flow. Reports become distribution channels for data, datasets become shared assets, workspaces become pseudo-applications, and publishing becomes a visibility event, not a governance event. So you get data publishing without lifecycle rigor. The same ownerless pattern appears here too. Workspaces without accountable owners, datasets with unclear stewardship, reports shared broadly because people need it, and a long tail of stale content that remains discoverable and trusted long after it should have been retired. And then Copilot shows up, and now your analytics layer becomes another retrieval surface. So what does governance look like when citizen development hits enterprise scale? It looks like an environment strategy first, not an app strategy. You need explicit tiers: personal development, departmental development, controlled test, and production. You need controlled promotion paths. So I built a thing does not automatically become the business depends on this. You need maker boundaries. Who can build where, who can use which connectors, and which data sources are allowed in which environments. That's not bureaucracy. That's the only way to keep a low-code estate from turning into an unbounded integration fabric. And you need least privilege execution. Stop letting apps and flows run under ambiguous connections and shared credentials. If you can't explain deterministically whose authority is being exercised, you've already lost control. Finally, you need controlled promotion. Not send me the link. Solutions move through environments. Changes are reviewed. Ownership is explicit. And retirement is enforced. Because the core law of Power Platform is the same law as the rest of Microsoft 365. If you don't enforce lifecycle, the system will preserve everything forever. Citizen development at enterprise scale isn't a threat to governance. It is governance, because the moment your business can build systems, your governance model has to treat builders like engineers and apps like software. Otherwise, you're not running a platform. You're running a hobby store with tenant-wide permissions. The silo tax. Why native governance can't converge. Now, the part nobody wants to admit out loud. Even if you do all the right things in each workload, native governance still can't converge into a single control model. Not because the admins are lazy, because the tenant isn't governed by one system. It's governed by a set of product silos with different policy primitives, different telemetry, and different lifecycle semantics. That's the silo tax. Every time you try to answer a simple question, you pay it. What resources do we have? Who owns them? Who has access? What changed this week? What is risky right now? Native tooling answers each of those questions partially, depending on which admin center you're standing in. And the moment you need the cross-service answer, you become the integration layer. You export from here, you correlate in Excel, you write a script, you build a Power BI report, you create a runbook. You hope it keeps working after Microsoft changes an API or a UI label. That's not governance, that's human middleware. Admin centers reflect product org boundaries, not tenant reality. Teams has its world. SharePoint has its world. Power Platform has its world. Entra has its world. Purview has its world. Copilot now has its world. Your tenant doesn't live in those worlds. Your tenant lives in the collisions between them. A team provisions a SharePoint site, a planner plan, a mailbox, a set of permissions. Then a user shares a file with an anyone link. Then a flow picks it up and emails it. Then Copilot summarizes it. Then an agent uses it as grounding. Then an auditor asks who approved it. Which admin center owns that incident? None of them. That distinction matters, because governance fails specifically in the seams, where an action in one workload becomes exposure in another, and no single native tool can represent that chain as a single risk object. Telemetry fragmentation is the next tax you pay. Each workload can show you what it thinks matters. Teams can show membership and some settings. SharePoint can show sharing and permissions, but not in a way that naturally maps to workspace risk. Power Platform can show flows, but not always in a way that maps to data sensitivity. Entra can show sign-ins and role activations, but it can't tell you whether the site being accessed is ownerless and overshared, so you can have visibility everywhere and still have no decision. That's governance theater at scale, dashboards without consequence. Policy fragmentation is even worse. Controls do not behave consistently across services. A label means something different depending on whether you're in Purview, SharePoint, Teams, or Office apps. External access means guests in Teams, sharing links in SharePoint, external identities in Entra, connectors in Power Platform, and web grounding in Copilot. And each of those has a different enforcement mechanism. Some settings block, some settings warn, some settings require licensing, some settings apply only to new objects. Some settings apply only if the user uses the modern experience. Some settings exist, but the user can override them with a justification that nobody reads. So you end up with inconsistent enforcement primitives across the tenant. That creates a predictable result. Policy drift. Not because people change the policy, because the policy doesn't mean the same thing everywhere, and new workloads keep introducing new pathways. Lifecycle fragmentation is the final bill. Creation exists everywhere. Retirement exists almost nowhere. Teams can be created through multiple surfaces. Groups can be created from Outlook. Sites can be created from SharePoint. Flows can be created from templates. Agents can be created from multiple builders. Content can be shared from OneDrive with one click. But when does the system force an end? When does it automatically degrade access? When does it route unowned resources to remediation? When does it prove that a workspace still has a justified business purpose? It doesn't. So governance becomes periodic review work. And periodic review work becomes fatigue. And fatigue becomes rubber stamping. And rubber stamping becomes entropy. The tenant keeps expanding. Your control model keeps eroding. And when you finally get a consolidated report, it's already stale because the system is dynamic and your governance process is batch-oriented. This is why native governance can't converge. Not because it's bad, because it's not a unified control plane. It's a collection of necessary components, each correct in isolation, none sufficient in aggregate. So the result is inevitable. Governance becomes manual correlation work, and manual correlation does not scale. And the only escape is to stop trying to govern 5 silos separately and hoping they add up to control. You need a layer that treats the tenant as one system. cross-service inventory, consistent ownership, lifecycle enforcement, and a risk model that understands blast radius across workloads. Otherwise, you're not governing Microsoft 365. You're chasing it. Control pattern 1. Ownership as a control plane. So here's the first control pattern that actually survives contact with reality: ownership as a control plane. Not we ask teams to nominate an owner, not we hope managers will keep it updated. Enforced ownership everywhere as a tenant primitive, because ownership is the only governance mechanism that can route decisions back to context. Policies don't have context, admins don't have context, audit logs don't have context. The only thing that reliably points to context is a human who is accountable for the resource. And if you don't have that, you don't have governance. You have a crime scene with a spreadsheet. So what does ownership as a control plane mean in practice? It means the tenant treats no owner as an invalid state, not an unfortunate condition. A team without an owner is not a collaboration space. It is an orphaned asset with unknown blast radius. A SharePoint site without an owner is not a site. It is an unbounded permission graph with no escalation path. A flow without an owner is not automation. It is an unaccountable integration running under ambiguous identity. And an agent without an owner is not innovation. It is an actor in your environment that nobody can explain. So the first part is enforcement, minimum owners, and not as guidance. As a rule, 2 owners is the baseline because it acknowledges turnover. 1 owner is a single point of organizational failure. And yes, it's fine. It's just a small project is how you end up with a tenant full of abandoned small projects that still contain data. Once you nail that, everything else clicks. Ownership becomes the anchor for every review, every escalation, every lifecycle decision, and every remediation workflow. The second part is visibility. Make ownership visible in a way that creates consequence. Most organizations technically have owners in places. They just don't have ownership as a governance signal. It's hidden in a UI. It's not monitored. It's not alerted. It's not reported in a way that someone is accountable for. So you build an ownership map: which resources exist, who owns them, and where the ownership is failing. Not quarterly, continuously. And you don't measure how many resources exist. You measure how many resources are unowned, because unowned is the failure state. The third part is remediation. No owner remediation can't be a human project. It has to be a system behavior. If a resource drops below minimum owners, it triggers a remediation loop with a grace period. That grace period exists because humans need time to fix things. But it is time-bound and it ends. During the grace period, the system notifies the remaining owners, the resource members, and the manager chain, depending on how your organization is structured. If no one responds, you escalate. Owner to manager, manager to governance team. Governance team to a defined resolution, reassign, archive, restrict, or delete. And this is the part people avoid because it feels harsh. If accountability cannot be restored, the resource must degrade. Not because you enjoy breaking things, because unaccountable assets are security debt generators. So you degrade access intentionally, you restrict external sharing, you block new guests, you disable public links, you move the resource to read-only, you quarantine the agent, you pause the flow, you stop the thing from continuing to expand its blast radius while nobody is responsible. That's not punishment, that is entropy containment. Now the question everyone asks next is, but how do we pick the new owner? You don't guess. You design an escalation path that is deterministic. Owners, then manager, then functional owner, then governance team. If you can't resolve ownership through a defined chain, then you've discovered a deeper organizational problem. The business doesn't actually own its own systems. And that is exactly what governance exists to expose. Here's the result this pattern produces when it's enforced continuously. Ownerless resources stop being a permanent condition and become a temporary incident. And that's the difference between governance and cleanup. Cleanup is a project. Ownership enforcement is a control plane behavior. So the big takeaway in this section is simple. You can't govern what nobody owns, and you can't scale governance if ownership isn't enforced by design. And once ownership exists, you finally get to do the next thing that native governance almost never enables cleanly. You can prioritize by risk instead of drowning in noise. Control pattern 2. Risk-based prioritization that actually works. Ownership gives you accountability. Risk-based prioritization gives you throughput because the next failure mode is predictable. Once you can finally see everything, you drown in it. You build reports, you find hundreds of issues, then nothing gets fixed because the team has no way to separate annoying from dangerous. This is where most governance programs die. They treat every finding like it matters equally. It doesn't. Equal severity thinking creates severity inflation, and severity inflation creates paralysis. When everything is red, nobody moves. They either ignore it or they chase whatever screams loudest. That's not prioritization. That's governance by irritation. Risk-based prioritization that works is brutally simple. You rank work by consequence, not by policy violation count. The inputs are stable. They don't depend on which admin center you're in. They don't depend on which product team named the control. They map to system behavior, blast radius, data sensitivity, external exposure, automation pathways. If you can score those 4 inputs consistently, you can sort the entire tenant by what will hurt first. Blast radius is the audience boundary. A team with 5 members is not the same risk as a team with 5,000. A file shared to one external guest is not the same as a file shared with anyone. A flow used by one person is not the same as a flow embedded in a critical process. The thing most people miss is that blast radius can be internal too. Everyone in the company links our internal exposure at enterprise scale. They turn one person's convenience into tenant-wide availability. Data sensitivity is not "this site has a confidential label." You already learned labels are not access governance. Sensitivity is the combination of what the data is and what it enables. Contracts, HR records, financials, customer data, identity artifacts, API keys, anything that materially changes business risk if it escapes. If you don't have a perfect classifier, fine. You don't need perfect, you need consistent. You need a model that errs on the side of protecting high-impact content sources and high-impact destinations. External exposure is exactly what it sounds like. Guests, anonymous links, and any path where the organization is no longer the only security boundary. And external now includes AI. If an agent can reach an external system, that is external exposure. If a flow can post to a third-party SaaS, that is external exposure. Automation pathways are the multiplier. A mispermissioned file is bad. A mispermissioned file that is automatically copied to a broader location is worse. A mispermissioned file that is automatically emailed to a distribution list is worse. A mispermissioned file that becomes a knowledge source for an agent that answers questions at scale is worse. Automation turns static risk into moving risk. And once risk moves, you lose the ability to contain it with periodic review. Now, here's the operational difference. Risk models don't exist to generate prettier dashboards. They exist to drive consequence. So you stop measuring findings. You measure fixes. You measure time to detection and time to remediation for the few categories that actually matter. That means you pick a small number of control objectives and enforce them aggressively. For example, high-risk Power Automate flows identified in under 7 days. Not we reviewed flows quarterly. 7 days, because the system can create 1,000 new flows between quarterly reviews. The volume will win, so you set a detection target that beats the platform's rate of entropy. You also separate quick wins from structural wins. Quick wins are things like ownerless remediation, expired links, anonymous links, blocked users lingering in membership lists, dead guests, abandoned workspaces. Structural wins are things like environment strategy, promotion paths, enforced expiration, governance routing, and consistent ownership enforcement across workloads. Most organizations invert this. They start with structural redesign because it feels strategic, but they don't stabilize the current mess. So they spend 6 months designing a future state while the current state keeps decaying. That's a trap. The better method is to kill the highest impact risk first, then use the recovered operational oxygen to build the structural controls that prevent it from returning. And you need reporting that drives action. The thing most people miss is that reporting is not evidence of control. Reporting is evidence of observation. Control requires consequence. So your dashboards don't show how many issues exist. They show what was fixed, what wasn't, who owns the backlog, and what will be escalated next. If a high-risk asset stays unresolved past your threshold, something happens. Access is degraded, sharing is restricted, the resource is quarantined, or the issue is forced into a decision queue. This is the core shift. Findings are not information. Findings are work. And work that doesn't get routed into consequence is just another form of theater. Once you have ownership and risk prioritization working together, you can finally answer the question everyone's pretending to answer already. Are you actually ready for Copilot? Now you can prove it because you can baseline the riskiest surfaces first instead of boiling the ocean. Ownership gives you accountability. Risk-based prioritization gives you throughput because the next failure mode is predictable. Once you can finally see everything, you drown in it. You build reports, you find hundreds of issues. Then nothing gets fixed because the team has no way to separate annoying from dangerous. This is where most governance programs die. They treat every finding like it matters equally. It doesn't equal severity thinking creates severity inflation, and severity inflation creates paralysis. When everything is red, nobody moves. They either ignore it or they chase whatever screams loudest. That's not prioritization. That's governance by irritation. Risk-based prioritization that works is brutally simple. You rank work by consequence, not by policy violation count. The inputs are stable. They don't depend on which admin center you're in. They don't depend on which product team named the control. They map to system behavior, blast radius, data sensitivity, external exposure, automation pathways. If you can score those 4 inputs consistently, you can sort the entire tenant by what will hurt first. Blast radius is the audience boundary. A team with 5 members is not the same risk as a team with 5,000. A file shared to one external guest is not the same as a file shared with anyone. A flow used by one person is not the same as a flow embedded in a critical process. The thing most people miss is that blast radius can be internal too. Everyone in the company links are internal exposure at enterprise scale. They turn one person's convenience into tenant-wide availability. Data sensitivity is not "this site has a confidential label." You already learned labels are not access governance. Sensitivity is the combination of what the data is and what it enables. Contracts, HR records, financials, customer data, identity artifacts, API keys, anything that materially changes business risk if it escapes. If you don't have a perfect classifier, fine. You don't need perfect. You need consistent. You need a model that errs on the side of protecting high-impact content sources and high-impact destinations. External exposure is exactly what it sounds like. Guests, anonymous links, and any path where the organization is no longer the only security boundary. And external now includes AI. If an agent can reach an external system, that is external exposure. If a flow can post to a third-party SaaS, that is external exposure. Automation pathways are the multiplier. A mispermissioned file is bad. A mispermissioned file that is automatically copied to a broader location is worse. A mispermissioned file that is automatically emailed to a distribution list is worse. A mispermissioned file that becomes a knowledge source for an agent that answers questions at scale is worse. Automation turns static risk into moving risk. And once risk moves, you lose the ability to contain it with periodic review. Now here's the operational difference. Risk models don't exist to generate prettier dashboards. They exist to drive consequence. So you stop measuring findings. You measure fixes. You measure time to detection and time to remediation for the few categories that actually matter. That means you pick a small number of control objectives and enforce them aggressively. For example, high-risk Power Automate flows identified in under 7 days. Not "we reviewed flows quarterly." 7 days, because the system can create 1,000 new flows between quarterly reviews. The volume will win, so you set a detection target that beats the platform's rate of entropy. You also separate quick wins from structural wins. Quick wins are things like ownerless remediation, expired links, anonymous links, blocked users lingering in membership lists, dead guests, abandoned workspaces. Structural wins are things like environment strategy, promotion paths, enforced expiration, governance routing, and consistent ownership enforcement across workloads. Most organizations invert this. They start with structural redesign because it feels strategic, but they don't stabilize the current mess. So they spend 6 months designing a future state while the current state keeps decaying. That's a trap. The better method is to kill the highest impact risk first, then use the recovered operational oxygen to build the structural controls that prevent it from returning. And you need reporting that drives action. The thing most people miss is that reporting is not evidence of control. Reporting is evidence of observation. Control requires consequence. So your dashboards don't show how many issues exist. They show what was fixed, what wasn't, who owns the backlog, and what will be escalated next. If a high-risk asset stays unresolved past your threshold, something happens. Access is degraded, sharing is restricted, the resource is quarantined, or the issue is forced into a decision queue. This is the core shift. Findings are not information. Findings are work. And work that doesn't get routed into consequence is just another form of theater. Once you have ownership and risk prioritization working together, you can finally answer the question everyone's pretending to answer already. Are you actually ready for Copilot? Now you can prove it because you can baseline the riskiest surfaces first instead of boiling the ocean. 700 words. AI-ready governance is where most tenants finally admit what they've been calling governance was just tolerance. Because Copilot and agents don't give you time. They don't wait for the quarterly review. They don't care about your policy document. They don't care that the owners will clean it up later. They accelerate whatever is true right now. So AI-ready governance is not a separate program. It is the same control plane patterns you already need. Ownership and risk applied specifically to the surfaces. AI amplifies permissions, content sprawl, and autonomous execution. Start with the part everyone wants to skip. Clean permissions before Copilot scales them. If you're rolling out Copilot into a tenant where everyone links exist, where company-wide links exist, where guest access drifted, and where abandoned teams still have broad membership, you are not doing a pilot. You are turning on a discovery engine for your historical mistakes. And you will spend the first month doing damage control, not adoption. So the AI-ready move is to baseline what Copilot can see today. Not in theory, not via policy intent. In reality, what exists, who can reach it, and what is stale. That baseline has 3 outputs that matter. First, your overshared content surfaces, the places where access boundaries are widest. Second, your ownerless surfaces, the places where nobody can certify intent. Third, your stale surfaces, the places where wrong but grounded answers will come from. This is why labels never fixed it. Labels can be part of the posture, but labels don't close an access path. Labels don't remove an external share. Labels don't fix broken inheritance. Labels don't delete the 5-year-old draft policy that should have been archived. So AI-ready governance treats permissions as the first-class control and treats content as an asset with lifecycle. Now here's the part that separates organizations that survive from organizations that flail. Govern agents before they govern you. Agents are software with reach. They're not helpful assistants. They are packaged authorization plus tools plus distribution. So the AI-ready pattern for agents is boring, and that's why it works. Builders are scoped, environments are tiered, publishing is controlled, and every agent is inventoriable, reviewable, and expirable. If an agent can execute actions, it gets treated like a workload identity. It has an owner, it has a life cycle, it has a review cadence, it has a retirement plan. And if it has no owner, it doesn't remain available but forgotten. It gets quarantined because unaccountable execution is not a feature. It is a liability. Now, the thing most people miss is that AI governance changes your audit posture. Traditional audits ask for policy configuration and evidence. AI-aware audits ask for explainability. Why did this agent have access to that data? Why did this user receive that output? Which sources were used? Which tool calls were made? Under which identity? That means your controls need to be provable, not just configured. You need to be able to show inventory, ownership, review history, and enforcement outcomes across the tenant. Not we have a setting. Here is the evidence trail. And the evidence trail can't be a scavenger hunt across 5 portals. It has to be a single narrative you can produce on demand. Now, outcomes. This is where you stay credible by refusing to promise miracles. AI-ready governance does not mean you will perfectly clean the tenant. It means you can establish a baseline in weeks because you're not boiling the ocean. You're isolating the highest risk surfaces first. Overshared, ownerless, externally exposed, and automated. And once you have that baseline, you can reduce audit prep time from weeks to days because you stop assembling evidence manually and start operating a system that logs decisions as part of the governance loop. That's the point. Governance becomes a continuous system, not a periodic human event. One more uncomfortable truth before we move on. AI will force you to confront the long tail because the long tail is where most risk hides. Stale sites, abandoned teams, forgotten OneDrives, old flows, old apps, old agents. AI makes that tail visible and actionable to normal users. So your governance response can't be, we'll do a cleanup project. It has to be, we'll run a continuous control plane that keeps the tail from growing. Ownership enforcement, risk prioritization, AI-specific baselining of what's visible and what's executable. That's AI-ready governance. And once you accept that, the next question is no longer philosophical. It's tooling. How do you enforce these patterns continuously across Teams, SharePoint, Power Platform, Entra, and Copilot without becoming the human integration layer? That's why a unified governance layer exists. Why a unified governance layer exists, making Microsoft governable. So here's where the conversation stops being about individual controls and starts being about system design. Native tools are necessary. They are not sufficient. They are necessary because you still need Entra to issue tokens, Purview to define retention and labeling, and workload admin centers to expose service-specific configuration. No serious architect argues otherwise, but sufficiency is the problem. A tenant is not one product. It's an ecosystem of authorization decisions, content surfaces, and automation pathways that constantly create new state. And native governance is architected as a set of workload silos, each with partial telemetry, partial policy primitives, and partial lifecycle features. That's not a moral failing. That's organizational reality expressed as software. So when leadership asks, why can't we just use Microsoft native governance? The correct answer is not because Microsoft is missing features. The correct answer is because the native governance model does not converge into a single control loop. A unified governance layer exists because someone has to treat the tenant as one system. That layer has to do 4 things continuously. First, cross-service inventory. Not a monthly export, not a point-in-time report. A living model of teams, groups, sites, OneDrives, apps, flows, agents, and identity artifacts with relationships intact. If you can't see the graph, you can't govern the graph. Second, ownership as an enforced primitive. Not owners are a column. Owners are a routable responsibility chain. That means minimum owners, owner drift detection, escalation paths, and forced reassignment or degradation when accountability disappears. Third, lifecycle enforcement. Create is easy. Retire is hard. A governance layer has to make retirement deterministic. Expiration, attestation, archive, deletion, and the mechanisms that trigger those outcomes when conditions are met. Otherwise, sprawl becomes permanent state. Fourth, a risk model that actually maps to consequence. Not this violates policy X, risk that incorporates blast radius, sensitivity, external exposure, and automation pathways, and then roots work into outcomes. Detect, notify, approve, remediate, and prove. That prove part matters more than most people admit. Audit isn't impressed by intention. audit cares about evidence, who owned it, who approved it when it was reviewed, what changed, and what you did about it. A unified layer turns governance from periodic observation into continuous enforcement with a trail. And no, this isn't another admin center. Architecturally, it is something else, a control plane above the workloads, translating tenant-wide intent into workload-specific enforcement. It doesn't replace native tools. It consumes them, correlates them, and forces the loop to close. That's what making Microsoft governable means, not perfect security. Predictable control. Conclusion: predictable control, not perfect governance. Governance fails when you mistake configuration for control, and Microsoft 365 happily punishes that mistake forever. If you want your tenant to become governable, stop chasing settings and start enforcing 3 primitives: ownership, lifecycle, and risk-based consequence, continuously across every workload. If you want the next episode, it'll be a practical walkthrough of the 3 control patterns end-to-end: how to enforce ownership at scale, how to score risk without drowning in noise, and how to baseline Copilot and agents before they baseline you. Subscribe and listen to next episode.